Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the first lecture of Organizational Sociology, SOC 455. Tonight, what I'm going to do is start you off with kind of an introduction to some of what you will probably be reading this week and what are some of the standout points I want to which I want to bring your attention for not just your first week's reading, but some of the concepts you're going to be to which you're going to be introduced throughout the next several weeks. So first of all, I want to reintroduce you to Max Weber, and you may remember Max Weber from Sociology 100 or some of the other sociology courses you've had. He was primarily interested in the changing patterns of political authority in governments as organizations. And if you look at Max Weber's years, 1864 to 1920, you may observe that he was probably seeing a lot of the Industrial Revolution at its height, and he saw basically a World War I, which was supposed to be the war that ended all wars. They didn't know World War II was going to come around, of course, at that time. So it always helps a little bit, for me anyway, when I am thinking about a theorist and what they present, to understand what they saw in their life, where they were, what they were doing, what they were seeing. So Max Weber was very much interested in the nature of power. In my intro to social class, sometimes I introduce the concept of scarce resources and ask kind of a tricky question: what is the ultimate? Now, what is the ultimate scarce resource? A lot of people say money and sometimes other things, but really it's power. If you have power, you have the ability to get the other scarce resources. And according to Max Weber, power is the ability to carry out one person's or group's will, even in the presence of resistance or opposition from others. And Weber pointed out two types of power. He identified two types of power. The first is legitimate power. It's the power that is accepted by the people in a society as being necessary and beneficial, even if it's not your candidate who always gets elected. Generally speaking, you accept that this particular structure of government, whether it's in a particular organization or it's of a whole country or state or city or something, is at least a legitimate power. So such as the power to make and enforce rules that benefit all or the majority. In other words, speed limits. Think about, company policies through HR. Let's make sure we're all, following OSHA's rules when we work, that we're observing the safety rules, so that we, are all kind of following that same legitimate power. And even if we don't like necessarily a rule, we kind of accept that overall structure, that power structure, really is a legitimate power. He also identified what he called coercion or illegitimate power, which is, simply put, power that is regarded as illegitimate by those over whom it is exerted. So, a government that is considered illegitimate by the people it governs may not be long for this world. They may be a coup d'etat. There may be other ways that they take that group out of power, that particular government. Now, Max Weber was he was the one who introduced this concept of bureaucracy. Now, bureaucracy, I know you bumped into this before, especially if you had classical social theory. But let's re-examine this from the perspective of social, kind of an organizational, sociological perspective, where an organization can be a society as well, can kind of be its own like mini society, kind of microcosm of society, sort of like a subculture is part of the overall culture, and an organization can have its own like mini society, can be viewed as a mini society. definitely interdependent with other organizations within society, but also with other societies. So, think of it as kind of studying a mini society, all of its own, with its own character, its own personality. So, what is a bureaucracy then? Well, Weber's definition is bureaucracy is a rational legal form of authority, what he called modern bureaucratic authority, governed by a set of impersonal rules and procedures that are applied universally without regard to the personal characteristics of individuals and rationally designed to serve some broader purpose. So speed limit laws. We have good data, scientific data that says when people go over a certain speed, there are more accidents that occur, or there are more fatalities from those accidents. So, the speed limits that are statewide, or it's even something like that could be national, or designed to protect a school zone or even a particular neighborhood, changing the speed limit in a particular neighborhood. You can see how at all levels this can, these rules that are applied universally. Without regard, everybody has to follow them. Okay, just because you're a Kennedy or a Rockefeller, ideally, at least, you're not supposed to be able to speed. You still have to follow those rules. So that's the definition of a bureaucracy. And we're going to be revisiting that later in the class as well, but keep that in mind when you're thinking about Max Weber, who really is kind of laid the foundation for what we call organizational sociology today. Now, Weber identified three kinds of authority, and you may have bumped into this before. Legal, rational, traditional, and charismatic authority. And just to make sure waters get really muddy, sometimes you'll see that first one as rational legal authority. Just realize whether they're calling it legal rational authority or rational legal authority, they're referring usually to one of Weber's three kinds of authority. And the first kind of authority he presented was legal rational authority. That's authority derived from the understanding that specific individuals have clearly defined rights and duties to uphold and implement rules and procedures impersonally. So power isn't vested in individuals. It's vested in particular positions or offices. The position of president has certain powers that go with it. And when a person who is elected president moves into the office and takes office, then they have that power. When they leave office, they no longer have that power. It's not saying they don't still have some power, some clout, and that people aren't going to pay them high prices to present at their at their college graduations or something. It just means they will not have the same power as the president when they leave office. Student body president, U.S. congressman, college professor. I'm hired to teach sociology. I can't just talk about chocolate chip cookie recipes or something up here. Not that I necessarily would, but we have certain duties to uphold and apply impersonally. The second kind of authority is traditional authority. And traditional authority is authority rooted in the assumption that the customs of the past legitimate the present. And typically, traditional authority is inherited. As long as tradition is followed, these rulers may be able to keep power. So it's when those traditional authority figures, like kings or queens, inherit this position, and then they, take people out of their norm, and they start acting in ways that the general populace considers non-traditional. Unless it's something that's extremely popular, then usually it can get them into a lot of trouble. And you hear about, again, coup d'etats. You hear about one person, killing another. One king, because somebody becomes king by killing another king, moving into that position. What will the public bear? So somebody like Henry VIII of England, who broke with the Pope, who broke with the Catholic Church, and became the head of, really the figurehead of the Anglican Church. you had this huge break occur, and the general public was not happy with that. The aristocracy was, because they could seize a lot of the property that belonged to the church. But the general public was not thrilled with that, and it really threatened his position. And in fact, the next person who moved in, when it was, you talked about Jane Grey, you talk about several. They had a back and forth that went. They went back to a more conservative Protestantism that went more towards Catholic, the Catholic, and then you had Jane Grey, and she was very very short lived, reigned for about a week, and before she was arrested, and then Henry VIII's daughter Mary, and you and who turned the official religion back to Catholicism, and then if my history serves me, somebody like Elizabeth, who came in and turned it to Protestantism, and it's been the Church of England ever since. But you had this huge upheaval and a lot of social, what we'd say is the popularity of these figureheads just plummeted. So, but they didn't have necessarily the wherewithal to overthrow the king. So when traditional authority figures act non-traditionally, then they're putting their own position often in peril. Now, charismatic authority figures. Charismatic authority derives from a ruler's ability to inspire passion and devotion among his or her followers. And charismatic leaders often emerge during times of crisis. So in times like when people lose a lot of faith in their current authority figures, they start looking for somebody to lead the way. Who is a good authority figure or ruler right now in terms of my values, in terms of where I'm going or where I want to go. So during times like the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, where you had so much social upheaval, so much change going on, and people, everything from the civil rights, the demands for civil rights, for equality for all groups, and then on up through Watergate. You had such a distrust of the American government, and you had this huge social upheaval and what we called that huge generation gap, and you had a lot of people who lost faith in their current system. So they were looking for, really that was ripe, fertile ground for charismatic authority figures to come along and inspire a lot of people. But charismatic leaders, like I said, often emerge in times of crisis. And Weber states that charismatic leaders emerge when 4 things happen. First of all, followers tend to perceive a leader as somehow supernatural, divinely inspired, even if the leader is like, no. It's not that I'm saying God is on my side or I'm on God's side, or however you see that, or that we are in the right. Sometimes even the leaders are like, no, they're not looking for this. And the same thing with number 2, followers unquestioningly believe the leader's statements. There are leaders out there who want people to think critically, who want people to question, and so whether they want it or not, these charismatic leaders often emerge when these 4 things happen. Followers are unquestioningly believe that charismatic leader's statements. Also, followers unconditionally comply with the leader's directives. And likewise, followers give that leader unqualified emotional commitment, absolute emotional commitment. If you're talking about people getting really whooped up, getting really, emotional and energized, and because it's connected with value systems, usually values of one sort or another, they are viscerally charged. They're the idea of what we believe should be, not always exactly what is. And charismatic leaders almost always possess outstanding speaking ability and seem to or do perform extraordinary feats. And many of these leaders emerge when people lose faith in their social institutions, as I said before. Now, don't get the idea that just because they're charismatic leaders, they're necessarily good or evil, or you don't classify them like the cowboy movies where they either wear a white hat or a black hat. Keep in mind that, charismatic leaders come from all different perspectives. So, you can look at Reverend Martin Luther King, you can look at Hitler, you can look at Lenin. All these people inspired, they were charismatic in that they inspired their followers to whatever aim. They followed that charismatic leader's qualities that we just listed, those 4 qualities that Weber lists, those 4 things that happen. So keep in mind as you study the different kinds of leadership roles, and also what makes a good follower, what makes somebody who's a good worker or a good member of any organization. What makes somebody charismatic, what makes them a leader within an organization and without. So keep those in mind as you're reading your homework for this week. Okay, a couple of other people to whom I want to bring your attention, a couple of concepts that make up the foundation of organizational sociology. Frederick Winslow Taylor, similar years, 1856 to 1915. He lived a few years earlier he was born a little bit earlier than Weber, and died a little earlier than Weber. He was also a rational systems theorist like Weber, but Taylor developed the methodology called scientific management. Okay, very, very important to us. And he observed several phenomena among workers in a business organization like a factory. So let's take a look at what he meant by what was he doing when he was pioneering the concept of scientific management. This is the study and application of tested methods to increase productivity by helping workers to work smarter, not necessarily harder, okay, more efficiently, not necessarily work until they were burned out. So again, Taylor observed several phenomena among workers in a business organization like a factory. First thing he observed was restriction of output, and this occurs when small work groups within an organization use peer pressure to enforce a moderate work pace on all their members. Okay, so you walk in first day and you look at the other workers and you look at what is their expectation of you. It's like, we make 10, if you make 20, you kind of make us look bad. Okay, so you look at a widget factory, for instance. You make 10 widgets, you fall into line with everybody else who's making 10 widgets. Then there's that restriction of output that occurs through peer pressure. So don't make the rest of the workers look bad. Taylor also observed what he called the speed up. If an individual works too hard at any time, management requires all members of the group to work to that standard all the time, but without a pay increase. So the process required of other workers by management is to match the pace of a faster working individual. Okay? And another thing that Taylor observed was what he called rate cutting. So once you have everybody working faster, and then they're making, the average person's making 15 widgets a day, those who are paid by the number of widgets, by the number of products produced, per product would now be paid at a lower rate per unit. They're not necessarily going to pay everybody more for making 15 widgets a day. If they say, okay, this is the standard of expectation now, not 10, but 15, they're going to pay a lower rate per unit. So Taylor wanted to stop the restriction of output and halt worker resistance to management's control of methods and pace, and he warned management not to rate cut, but to instead teach norms of production behavior and expect workers to conform to them. So according to his observations, Taylor said workers tend to work as slowly as they can, but still keep their positions, okay, because they have no incentive to do otherwise. So Taylor proposed the importance of creating incentives for workers to improve their productivity. And right now you're probably saying, well, yeah, but realize that this was something very new. Taylor was also seeing the Industrial Revolution and the move of people from, outlying villages and towns to working in factories and often in urban settings, and you had this mass kind of movement into the cities of people, and suddenly everybody's doing a similar or same job, and they have a specialization, and they're not working for themselves, they're working for a boss. So Taylor proposed the importance of creating these incentives for workers to improve their productivity. So what are special incentives? Well, special incentives means that managers provide incentives to workers to motivate them to put forward their best initiative, to produce at a greater pace and or better quality. And these could be promotions or wage increases, etc. Okay. And initiative and incentive management systems are ones in which the workers give their best initiative and management provides sufficient special incentive. So in other words, it's also the onus is also on on management and the bosses to provide sufficient incentive for a worker to do better, to work harder. Okay. One thing about Frederick Winslow Taylor is he was actually a mechanical engineer. So he was like at an organization almost as if it were a machine. How could you run a better machine, make sure it's well oiled? How do you make sure that everything within the machine is functioning well? So, actually as a mechanical engineer, he was still observing social behavior. So this was pretty early on in the study of organizations as within sociology, as kind of microcosms of society, or their own little societies. One thing more to which I want to bring your attention is Burns and Stocker's concept of mechanistic and organic systems. So, building on what Taylor had presented, Burns and Stocker, in the 1950s and 60s, Burns and Stocker studied British textiles, which heavy industry and electronic firms, and found that firm structure depended a great deal on whether the firm operated in a stable or kind of a fast-changing environment. So firms that produce a familiar product using old technologies such as and product characteristics and consumer demand are relatively stable, like the textile factories, tended to conform to traditional bureaucratic models. So that's what Burns and Stocker called mechanistic systems. Mechanistic systems are those in which centralized decision-making, specialization, sharply defined duties, formal rules, and hierarchical control are efficient ways to organize routine and repetitive activity in a predictable environment. So you have the CEO and it moves down. There's not a lot of contact between people at the bottom of the pyramid and people at the top. It's possible you only contact your own boss. You're not contacting your boss's boss and that sort of thing. It might not even be done or considered appropriate. Then there are organic systems, and Burns and Stocker said, look, there are organic systems. There are those in which the structure of firms, the structure of firms are more loose. The job definitions and boundaries between functions are more flexible, and rules are less formalized. Employees exercise more discretion, and hierarchy is less pronounced. So you may be meeting with people from all over the company at all different levels, and there's a little bit more of an openness and sharing of ideas. Now, this was during the 50s and 60s, and expanding on Burns and Stocker, you had what we call contingency theory. Lawrence and Lorsch presented contingency theory, which points out that the structure of successful firms is kind of contingent on the kind of environment and conditions in which they function. So certain organizations are more prone to being mechanistic and certain are prone to being organic. So in 1967, Paul Lawrence and Jay Lorsch observed that some departments, such as those in research and development, have less predictable environments and futures than those in manufacturing. So departments within organizations that face different levels of change could be defined as more or less organic or more or less mechanistic. So, like brainstorming organizations, people who were more in invention and technology and design, there might be a more organic department in the same organization. And then you have a more mechanistic department where it's actually putting these inventions together and producing them, mass producing. Okay. Also building on this, theorist Joan Woodward later observed that most modern organizations are organic systems. So, as you get closer to 2000, 2000 and the new millennium, you're looking at more and more organic systems being the norm, to the point where it's almost all organic systems. Mechanistic systems are a part of the period in which the previous theorists lived, was the point she was making. And they reflect the Industrial Revolution's organizations, which are now outdated. So she was pointing out really most organizations in the United States, because there are very few manufacturing jobs compared to services and actually the distribution of goods. She was pointing out, look, that most organizations in the United States now are organic in nature. Okay, and last point to make, Robert Dubin built on all that previous information, including Woodward. It said that there were two phases of technology that we had to keep in mind. The first is tools, instruments, and machines that are seminal to the job. What is important for getting the job done? All the material culture needed to produce whatever it is that organization produces. And then there are, number two, the ideas that express goals, the rationale of methods, and functional importance. What this is, and this is going to sound very familiar, especially in the new millennium, we are very much aware of what we call intellectual property. Making sure we give credit where credit is due, making sure that we realize that people can actually own an idea. And to understand that was really a very gray area until the past a couple of decades. There wasn't as much protection of what we call intellectual property. If you had a patent, you presented it, you've gone through all the steps of patenting an idea. But now the laws are more restrictive for what you can copyright or what you consider to be intellectual property of one person or another, and people will sue people over stealing. Hey, they stole my idea. So really, this was Dubin's concept of two phases of technology was really a precursor to our current understanding of what is intellectual property. Okay, so that is kind of the economy tour of the introductory information you need to launch yourself into organizational sociology this week. If you have questions or would like to talk further about any of these concepts, please visit the virtual office and post to ask questions of your professor and to further discuss these topics with your peers. Thank you for coming.